The cold of the bare floorboards seeped through Ilara's thin socks, a final biting insult from the apartment that was no longer hers. The silence was the worst part. It was a thick, heavy blanket where the rhythmic gasp of her husband's oxygen machine and his weak cough had once been the soundtrack of their lives. Now the only sound was the scrape of her own ragged breathing and the faint clink of coins on the worn kitchen table. $87. She counted them again, her chapped fingers tracing the cold metal profiles of forgotten presidents. $87.35, one to be precise. The eviction notice, a stark white ghost on the counter, seemed to mock her. Its bold, black letters screamed a truth her heart refused to accept. It was over. Everything was gone. Her husband, her home, her hope. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, a familiar companion these last few weeks. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was more than just a lack of food. It was an emptiness that consumed her from the inside out, a hollow where a future used to be. She looked over at Leo, her 8-year-old son, huddled in the corner. He was wrapped in his only coat, a garment too small at the wrists, his face pale and smudged with a dirt streak he was too tired to notice. He wasn't crying. That's what broke Ilara's heart the most. He was trying to be a little man, a stoic soldier in a war he couldn't possibly understand. He clutched a worn-out wooden car, a last gift from his father, its wheels long since broken off. Ilara felt a familiar, sharp pang in her chest, the unique agony of a parent who cannot provide, cannot protect. She could feel the chill of the room wrap around them, a predator stalking its weakened prey. Her hands, once nimble and sure as they guided fabric under the needle of her sewing machine, were now stiff and clumsy, clenched into useless fists at her sides. She remembered her husband's promise, whispered in the dark as his illness tightened its grip. "I'll always take care of you and Leo." The memory was a shard of glass twisting in her soul. He was gone and she was failing. The debt was a monster that lived in a stack of manila envelopes. Each one held a new horror, a bill for a procedure she couldn't pronounce, for a medication that hadn't worked, for a night in a room that smelled of bleach and despair. The numbers swam before her eyes, a tidal wave of ink that had drowned them. They had sold everything of value. First, her mother's jewelry, then the good furniture, finally, her Singer sewing machine, the extension of her own hands, the tool that had always been their salvation. The memory of the pawnshop owner's indifferent gaze as he counted out a pittance for it made her stomach clench. He didn't see the school uniforms she'd made, the wedding dress alterations that paid for groceries, the patched-up knees on Leo's trousers. He saw only metal and wood. Her craft, her identity, had been sold for scrap. Now, her hands felt foreign, empty. The grief for her husband was a constant, dull roar, but this new grief, for her own lost purpose, was a sharp, piercing scream that no one else could hear. Then came the letter. It arrived 2 days ago, a thin, flimsy envelope with a postmark from a town she'd only ever heard of in hushed family stories. Inside, a single sheet of paper from a distant cousin she barely knew, a man eager to wash his hands of any familial obligation. The words were cold, clinical. He mentioned an ancestral home, a collapsing ruin she technically co-inherited but had never seen. "A roof over your head," he had written, the phrase dripping with condescension. Taped to the bottom of the letter was a single rust-eaten key. It wasn't an offer of help. It was an act of disposal. He was giving her permission to inhabit the attic, a space, the letter noted, that had been nailed shut for 50 years. The street or a forgotten, rotting house in the middle of nowhere, those were her choices. A wave of dizziness washed over Ilara as she clutched the key in her palm. The metal was cold and jagged, its teeth promising to open a door not to a home, but to an entirely new kind of prison, one made of isolation and decay. Standing in the doorway for the last time, Ilara pulled the door shut. The click of the lock echoed down the empty hallway, a sound of absolute finality. She took Leo's small, cold hand in hers, his fingers curling tightly around her own, a silent testament of trust she felt she hadn't earned. Outside, the city lights blurred into a watercolor painting, through the tears she refused to let fall. The air was frigid, biting at their exposed skin. $87. It was the price of a bus ticket to the edge of the world. and maybe a loaf of bread. She felt the key in her pocket, a cold weight against her thigh, a symbol of her complete surrender to fate. She looked down at her son, his wide, frightened eyes searching hers for an assurance she couldn't give. This was it. No other path remained. She was a mother with nothing left, stepping into an unknown darkness for the boy whose hand she held. How far would you go to protect your child from the cold reality of the world? If stories of a mother's fierce love and unyielding survival resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed for what comes next. The bus engine rumbled, a low, constant vibration that traveled from the floor, up through Ilara's worn-out shoes, and settled deep in her bones. It felt like the purr of a great, indifferent beast, carrying them away from everything they had ever known. Leo had fallen asleep against her side, his small body limp with exhaustion, his cheek pressed against the cold, vibrating window. Outside, the familiar cityscape, with its sharp angles and concrete canyons, began to bleed into the softer, grayer shapes of the suburbs. Each mile marker they passed was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her old life. Ilara felt a treacherous flicker of hope, a tiny, stupid spark that she immediately hated herself for feeling. It was the hope of the truly desperate, the foolish belief that any change must be for the better. Her stomach churned, a toxic mix of hunger and anxiety. She clutched the $87 in her pocket, the paper bills now soft and crumpled, feeling the warmth of her own fear imprinted upon them. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside. The landscape transformed, becoming more ragged and forgotten. The neat suburban lawns gave way to overgrown fields, then to dense, dark patches of woods that seemed to crowd the narrow road, their branches like skeletal fingers scratching at the bus windows. The few houses they passed looked shuttered and suspicious, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. With each stop, the bus emptied, leaving Ilara and Leo more and more isolated in the cavernous, echoing vehicle. The air grew thick with the smell of diesel fumes and the faint, sweet scent of decaying leaves. Ilara felt a cold dread begin to coil in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't a journey to a new beginning. It was a descent. She could feel the world shrinking around them, pulling them toward a place that civilization had left behind. Leo stirred in his sleep, murmuring his father's name, and a fresh wave of grief, sharp and suffocating, washed over her. The bus driver, a man with a face like a road map of tired disinterest, called out the name of the village, his voice flat and empty. "End of the line," he grunted, not even bothering to look at them in the rear-view mirror. The bus hissed to a stop in a cloud of diesel smoke, its doors groaning open to reveal not a town, but a dusty patch of gravel on the side of a lonely two-lane road. There was no station, no bench, no shelter, just a leaning, moss-covered sign with the village name barely legible. The driver tossed her single battered suitcase onto the dirt with a thud that seemed to punctuate their arrival. As the bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the twilight, a profound silence descended. It was a heavy, unnerving quiet, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grass. Ilara felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a tiny, insignificant figure stranded at the edge of the world with her sleeping child. Ilara gently shook Leo awake. His eyes fluttered open, wide and confused, taking in the desolate surroundings. "Are we there, Mama?" he asked, his voice small and fragile in the vast emptiness. She forced a smile that felt like cracking glass. "Almost home, sweet boy. Just a little walk." The cousin's letter had said the house was a mile down the main path. The path was barely more than a dirt track, rutted and uneven, disappearing into the gloomy woods. Ilara grabbed the handle of their suitcase, its cheap plastic groaning in protest, and with Leo's small hand clutching hers, she began to walk. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. Every crunch of their feet on the gravel felt unnaturally loud, an intrusion on the ancient silence of the place. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes from the darkened woods, and a primal fear, the fear of the hunted, made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The isolation was a physical presence. They passed the first houses of the village, though village felt too generous a term. They were more like scattered, wounded animals hunkered down in the fading light. A few dim yellow lights glowed weakly behind drawn curtains, but there were no sounds of life, no televisions, no laughter, no dogs barking, just the same oppressive silence. A figure stood silhouetted in a doorway, watching them pass without a wave or a word, a phantom in the deepening twilight. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, a primal smell that spoke of long, hard winters. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was a place that didn't welcome strangers. It was a closed circuit, a community sealed off from the outside world, and she and Leo were a foreign element, an anomaly. Her cousin's condescending words, "a roof over your head," echoed in her mind, now laced with a sinister irony. He hadn't sent her to a home. He had exiled her to a graveyard of forgotten souls. The path finally opened into a small, weed-choked clearing, and there it was. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, and the little spark of hope she had foolishly harbored was instantly, brutally extinguished. The house was a nightmare. It wasn't a ruin. It was a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. It sagged to one side, as if it had given up the will to stand. The roof was a patchwork of missing shingles and gaping holes, a sieve against the sky. The porch listed at a drunken angle. Its floorboards rotted through. Most of the windows were shattered, dark, empty sockets in a weathered, grey-planked face. An ancient ivy vine had completely consumed one side of the house, its thick, gnarled tendrils clawing at the structure like a monstrous green hand. The rusty key in her pocket suddenly felt absurd, a useless trinket against such comprehensive decay. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure despair. This wasn't a shelter. This was a tomb. It was worse, so much worse than the street. Leo let out a small gasp, his hand tightening its grip on hers. "Is that it, Mama? It looks broken." Ilara couldn't find the words to answer him. All she could do was nod, the motion feeling heavy and defeated. They stepped through what was once a gate, now just two rust-eaten hinges clinging to a listing post. The front yard was a wilderness of thorns and knee-high weeds, and the stone path to the front door was all but swallowed by the earth. The silence here was different. It wasn't just empty. It was heavy with the weight of decay. The air was thick with the stench of rot and wet, stagnant things. As they got closer, she could hear the house breathing. A low, mournful whistle of wind through the broken panes of glass, a rhythmic drip, drip, drip from somewhere inside, a constant, faint creaking of stressed wood. It was the sound of a structure in its final death throes. She felt a wave of dizziness, and for a moment the world tilted. The house seemed to lean toward her, ready to collapse and bury them both in its rotten heart. The front door was a monstrosity of swollen, waterlogged wood, its blue paint almost entirely peeled away to reveal the splintered grey beneath. A large, jagged hole near the bottom looked as if some desperate animal had tried to chew its way in or out. The key she held seemed impossibly small and frail. She slid it into the lock, the metal grinding against layers of rust. It wouldn't turn. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed, the rough wood scraping against her thin coat. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. They were locked out of a ruin. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her throat. She pushed again, harder, putting all her desperation, all her grief, and all her rage into the effort. There was a loud crack, not of the lock but of the wood around it splintering. The door groaned inwards just enough for them to squeeze through. The air that rushed out to meet them was a physical blow. It was a blast of cold, cloying air that smelled of 100 years of dust, dampness, and the ghosts of dead things. The inside was even worse. The darkness was nearly absolute, thick and suffocating. The meager light from the doorway revealed a floor coated in a slimy layer of grime and fallen plaster. Furniture lay in broken, spectral shapes, draped in cobwebs as thick as shrouds. A grand staircase, its banister rotted away, ascended into the oppressive blackness of the upper floor. The dripping sound was louder in here, echoing in the vast, dead space. Every surface seemed to be slick with a film of dampness, and the cold was a living entity, seeping into her bones and making her teeth chatter. Leo whimpered and pressed his face into her leg, hiding from the monstrous shapes in the gloom. Ilara felt the last of her strength drain away. She had led her son from the relative safety of a cold, empty apartment into a place of active, malevolent decay. Her cousin's letter had mentioned the attic, nailed shut for 50 years. She looked up the ruined staircase, into the darkness, and felt a profound, Soul-crushing certainty. The attic would not be their salvation, it would be their tomb. Following the cousins' crude instructions, they found the attic access at the end of a dark, narrow hallway on the second floor. It wasn't a door, but a square panel in the ceiling, its edges sealed with a thick brown residue of age and grime. It was held shut by several large, rusty nails that had been hammered directly through the panel and into the surrounding frame. 50 years. It had been sealed for half a century. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traveled down Ilara's spine. What was in there that someone wanted it sealed so securely? The hope of finding a usable space had long since died, replaced by a morbid, weary curiosity. In a corner, half buried in debris, she found an old, heavy crowbar, its metal pitted with rust. Her hands, stiff with cold, felt clumsy as she gripped it. The weight felt alien. She was a seamstress, a creator of soft, beautiful things. Now she stood in a rotting house, holding a tool of destruction, preparing to break into a 50-year-old prison. Her life had become unrecognizable. Ilara balanced precariously on a rickety wooden chair she'd dragged from a nearby room, its legs wobbling on the uneven floorboards. She jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the seam of the attic panel. She put her weight into it, grunting with effort. The wood groaned in protest, but the nails held fast. Leo watched from the hallway, his face a small pale oval in the gloom, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Be careful, Mama," he whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the dead air. She tried again, aiming for a different spot. Leveraging the crowbar with all her might, a nail shrieked as it was slowly pried from the old wood. The sound was deafening in the silence. One by one, with agonizing slowness and the screech of protesting metal, she worked the nails free. A fine shower of dust, rust, and desiccated insect parts rained down on her, getting in her hair and eyes. Finally, with a loud crack of splintering wood, the panel gave way, swinging downward on one remaining hinge to hang like a broken jaw. The smell that descended from the opened hatch was a physical force. It was a suffocating, gag-inducing wave of pure decay. It was far worse than the general rot of the house below. This was the concentrated stench of 50 years of stagnant air, of slow decomposition, of things best left unnamed. It was the thick, cloying smell of mold, so potent it felt like it was coating her tongue. It was the dry, dusty scent of countless generations of spiders and insects, living and dying in the dark. And underneath it all was something else, a faint, acrid smell, like old paper, and something vaguely metallic and sad. Ilara recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth, her stomach heaving. The nausea she'd been fighting all day surged, and she choked back a mouthful of bitter bile. This wasn't just the smell of neglect. It felt ancient, malevolent. It smelled like a secret that had been left to fester and rot in the darkness for half a century. Whatever was up there, it was not a place for the living. The air itself was a poison. Taking a deep, shuddering breath of the cleaner, but still foul air in the hallway, Ilara used a small, flickering lighter she had to peer into the darkness above. The tiny flame cast long, dancing shadows, revealing a scene of absolute desolation. The space was small, cramped by the steep angles of the roof. The floor was invisible, hidden beneath a thick, unbroken carpet of grey dust that looked like a layer of filthy snow. It swallowed all sound, muffling the world. In the center of the space, a single forlorn wooden chair sat alone, as if waiting for a ghost. Cobwebs, thick as cotton batting, hung from the rafters in great, sagging loops. A single window on the far wall was completely boarded over, allowing no light, no view, no escape. The weak flame of her lighter reflected off something wet on the floor, and she realized with a sinking heart that the rhythmic dripping she'd heard was here. The roof was leaking in several places, creating dark, spreading stains in the dust. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, and crawled into the attic. The dust immediately billowed up around her, a choking cloud that filled her nose and lungs. It was freezing. The wind howled outside, finding its way through the countless holes in the roof, creating drafts that cut through her thin clothes like knives. The space was a wind tunnel of icy air and the smell of decay. This wasn't a shelter from the elements. It was a concentration of them. It was colder and damper up here than it was outside. This was the roof over her head, her cousin had offered. A freezing, leaking, dust-choked box that had been sealed for 50 years. The sheer cruelty of it, the casual indifference, was a physical blow. She felt a tear, hot and sharp, trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of pure, impotent rage. She had brought her son to this. She had followed the last, desperate path available to her, and it had led them to a place worse than any nightmare. Leo's small, pale face appeared in the opening. "Mama?" he asked, his voice trembling. She couldn't let him see her despair. She forced her voice to be steady. "It's okay, Leo. Come on up. We'll be warm soon." It was a lie, the most blatant, hollow lie she had ever told. He scrambled up, his small body immediately starting to shiver violently as the drafts hit him. He looked around the desolate space, at the thick dust and the dripping water, and his face, which had been so brave for so long, finally crumpled. A heartbreaking sob escaped his lips. Ilara's own heart shattered. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around his small, trembling frame. Burying her face in his hair, the attic offered no comfort, no warmth, no hope. It was a prison cell at the top of a dying house, holding her shivering, crying son in the absolute darkness, with the smell of rot in her nostrils and the sound of the wind mocking her. Ilara finally understood. They had not been saved. They had been buried alive. The false hope was gone, leaving only a cold, hard, and terrifying truth. The first night in the attic was a descent into a new circle of hell, a cold that was actively malevolent. Ilara lay on the dusty floorboards, the splintered wood digging into her back through her thin coat. She had wrapped Leo in every spare piece of clothing they owned, creating a small, pathetic cocoon against the biting drafts that whistled through the gaps in the roof. She held him tightly against her, trying to pour the last of her own body heat into his small, shivering frame. His breaths were shallow puffs of white in the frigid air. Despair was no longer an emotion. It was the very air she breathed, the dust she inhaled, the cold that seeped into her bones. She closed her eyes, and the darkness behind her eyelids was no different from the suffocating blackness of the attic. She felt her heart constrict in her chest, a physical pain of absolute failure. She had promised to protect him, and she had led him here, to a place where the cold itself felt like a predator, slowly draining the life from them. The night stretched before them, an eternity of freezing misery. All around them, the house groaned and settled, a symphony of decay. The constant, rhythmic dripping of water into a puddle somewhere in the dark was a maddening torture, a clock ticking down to their doom. The wind howled around the eaves, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to mock their isolation. With every gust, a fine shower of ancient dust and debris would drift down from the rafters, coating their faces, a gritty reminder of the filth they were buried in. Ilara's throat was raw, and her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot of hunger and fear. She tried to think of anything else, a warm memory, her husband's smile, the smell of baking bread in their old apartment, but the suffocating stench of mold and damp rot was too powerful. It clung to her, invaded her lungs, and erased every good thought. She felt a profound sense of shame. This was her fault. She was the adult, the parent, and she had led them into this tomb, this forgotten corner of the world, where they would simply cease to exist. Leo stirred in his sleep, his body racked by a violent shiver that shook them both. He whimpered, a small, wounded animal sound that tore through the fragile composure Ilara was trying to maintain. "I'm so cold, Mama," he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. The words were a physical blow, more painful than any insult. She pulled him impossibly closer, her arms aching, trying to shield him with the inadequate warmth of her own body. Silent tears, hot and bitter, began to stream down her face, freezing almost instantly on her cheeks. She felt utterly powerless, stripped of every tool a mother should have. She couldn't offer warmth. She couldn't offer food. She couldn't even offer a single word of genuine hope. All she could do was hold him in the crushing dark and listen to the sound of his teeth chattering, a tiny, frantic rhythm that was the true sound of her breaking heart. Her hands, once capable and skilled, were now just frozen claws, failing at their most fundamental task, to comfort her child. It was in that abyss of despair, when she was certain she was losing her mind to the cold and the dark, that she heard it. At first, It was so faint she thought it was just another trick of the wind, a high-pitched whistle in the rafters. But it wasn't. It was a melody, a simple, structured line of music, thin and ethereal, like a memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. She held her breath, straining to listen over the wind and the dripping water. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The melody repeated, a simple, melancholic loop of just a few notes. A lullaby. A ghostly, heartbreakingly sad lullaby that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. A fresh wave of nausea washed over her. She was hallucinating from hunger and exhaustion. That was the only explanation. This house was not just rotting. It was driving her mad, seeding her despair with phantom sounds of impossible beauty and sorrow. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for the silence to return. But the music didn't stop. It continued its patient, ghostly refrain, weaving itself into the sounds of the attic's decay. It was strangely clear, not a fuzzy or distorted memory, but a crisp, if faint, series of notes played on what sounded like tiny bells. The tune was achingly familiar, one of those ancient melodies that seems to be embedded in collective memory, a song a mother might hum to a sick child. In the context of this frozen, derelict space, it was monstrous. It was the sound of a childhood that had died here, a warmth that had long since turned to ice. An involuntary shiver, colder than any draught, ran down Ilara's spine. Her skin prickled with a primal fear. The exhaustion and hunger were real, but this sound, this felt just as real. She felt the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was suddenly overwhelming. The presence in the attic wasn't just the cold or the rot. It was something else, something that was singing. Holding her son seemed to offer a small anchor in a sea of rising terror. She tried to rationalize it. It was the wind blowing through a crack in a specific way. It was a neighbor's wind chime, carried for miles on the still night air, but the sound was too close, too contained. It didn't fade or change with the gusts of wind. It was constant, rhythmic, and impossibly, it seemed to be coming from inside the house, from inside the attic with them. The fear began to curdle into something else, a strange and morbid curiosity. The despair that had paralyzed her moments before was being pushed aside by a new, active emotion. What was making that sound? The question was a hook that snagged her mind, pulling her focus away from the cold and the hunger. She was still terrified, but it was a different kind of terror now. Not the passive horror of her situation, but the active dread of a mystery beginning to unfold. Her heart was hammering, but now it was with a terrible anticipation, just as she was convincing herself it was a waking dream. Leo shifted in her arms, his shivering momentarily subsiding. He wasn't fully awake, but his eyes were open, staring into the darkness. "Mama," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Who's singing?" The question struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. A gasp escaped her lips. It wasn't her. It wasn't a hallucination. He heard it too. The validation sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her system, clearing her head and sharpening her senses. The music was real. The ghostly lullaby was a tangible thing in this room. "I don't know, my love," she whispered back, her voice trembling despite her best effort to keep it calm for him. "Stay here, under the coat. Don't move. I'm just going to see what it is." Her words sounded braver than she felt. Her entire body was screaming at her to stay put, to not disturb whatever phantom was sharing this space with them. But the mother in her, the part that needed to identify the threat, was stronger. Slowly, carefully, she unwrapped herself from Leo, tucking the coat more securely around him. The instant she moved away, the brutal cold attacked her. But she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the sound. She got to her feet, her joints cracking in protest. The dust on the floorboards billowed silently around her ankles like disturbed spirits. Using the flickering flame of her lighter for a few seconds at a time to conserve its fuel, she tried to pinpoint the source of the music. It seemed strongest near the main wall, the only interior wall of the attic, the one that separated it from the rest of the house. She moved toward it, her stockinged feet making no sound in the thick dust. Each step was a deliberate act of will, pushing against the instinct to flee. The lullaby grew marginally louder as she approached the wall, its sad, simple tune an invisible thread pulling her forward into the darkness and the unknown. She could feel her own pulse in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the ghostly music. She reached the wall. The plaster was icy cold to the touch, and damp, crumbling under the slightest pressure from her fingertips. She pressed her ear against its surface, closing her eyes to focus every ounce of her attention on the sound. The wind and the dripping faded into the background, and there it was, unmistakable, clear. The music was coming from inside the wall. It wasn't echoing from another room. It was right here, muffled by a few inches of plaster and wood. A wild, impossible thought flashed through her mind. Something was alive in there. A trapped bird? A squirrel with a child's toy? No, the sound was too precise, too mechanical. It was like a tiny, perfect machine ticking away in a hidden tomb. A profound sense of wrongness washed over her. Things were not supposed to be sealed inside walls, especially not things that played music. She ran her hand over the cold, rough surface, a sense of grim purpose starting to form in the pit of her stomach. A new kind of energy, born of fear and a desperate need for answers, surged through her. She began to tap on the wall with her knuckles, moving methodically from one side to the other. Most of the wall responded with a dull, solid thud, the sound of plaster over thick, ancient timbers. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was absorbed by the dense material, flat and final. She moved along the wall, her knuckles getting raw from the rough surface, her ears straining to hear a difference. The lullaby continued its patient serenade, a constant companion to her search. It was as if it were guiding her, encouraging her to keep going. She felt like a character in a dark fairy tale, following a magical sound to an uncertain fate. The image was so absurd, so terrifying, that a shaky, half-hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips. Her life had been reduced to this, a freezing, starving woman tapping on a wall in a haunted attic, hunting for a ghost's song. Then she found it. Her knuckles struck a section of the wall and the sound was completely different. It wasn't a thud, it was a thump. A hollow, resonant thump that echoed back at her, vibrating through the bones in her hand. Her heart leaped into her throat, beating a frantic, wild tattoo against her ribs. She froze, her hand still pressed against the spot. The music seemed loudest right here. She tapped again, gently this time. Thump. She moved her hand a foot to the left. Thud. A foot to the right. Thud. She had found it. A section of the wall, roughly a meter square chun, was hollow. It was a void hidden behind the plaster. A loop of questions instantly opened in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Why was it hollow? What was inside? Who had hidden it? And why? The mystery of the sound had led her to a physical place, a tangible secret waiting to be broken open. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a burning, all-consuming need to know. She ran her fingers over the hollow section, her senses heightened. The plaster here was different. It was covered in a web of fine, spidery cracks, more so than the rest of the wall. It looked as though it had been repaired long ago. The new layer of plaster subtly different in texture, smoother in some places, rougher in others. It was a clumsy patch job, one meant to be hidden in the permanent darkness of a sealed attic. Someone had built something into this wall and then tried to hide the evidence. The realization was a jolt of electricity. This wasn't part of the original house. It was an alteration, a secret. Her mind raced back to the old rust-pitted crowbar she had found, the one she had used to pry open the attic hatch. It was lying in the corner where she'd left it, a dark shape in the gloom. It was a tool of brute force, of destruction. But at that moment, it felt like the key to everything. It was the only way she would get an answer. Ilara grabbed the crowbar, its cold, heavy iron a shock to her frozen hands. The weight of it felt substantial, real, a solid object in a world that had become ghostly and uncertain. She stood before the hollow section of the wall, the tool held in both hands. Her knuckles were white, her grip tight. She could feel the muscles in her arms and back tense. All the pain, the hunger, the grief, the rage at her cousin, at her poverty, at the universe. It all seemed to flow down her arms and into the metal bar. This was it, an act of violation, an act of defiance. She was no longer a passive victim of her circumstances. She was going to tear a hole in this house and rip its secret out. She took a deep, shuddering breath. the freezing air burning her lungs, and swung. The sharp end of the crowbar hit the plaster with a sickening crunch. The sound was shockingly loud in the confined space, a violent intrusion on the soft melody of the lullaby. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from the point of impact, a fine, choking cloud of white plaster dust, and something darker, something that smelled of rot and age, exploded into the air, making her cough. The lullaby played on, its delicate notes a bizarre counterpoint to her act of destruction. She swung again, with more force this time. A large chunk of plaster broke away, clattering onto the floorboards and disappearing into the thick layer of dust. Beneath it was not brick or solid timber, but a grid of thin, dark wooden slats, the lath. The hollow sound was even more pronounced now. There was definitely a space behind them. Her heart hammered with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was breaking something old and forbidden, crossing a boundary she wasn't meant to cross. She jammed the forked end of the crowbar between the slats and pulled, putting her entire body weight into it. The old wood was dry and brittle. With a shriek of tortured nails and a loud crackle of splintering wood, a section of the lath tore free. The sound was like breaking ribs. Ilara stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as more of the wall collapsed inward. A hole, dark and gaping, now stared back at her from the center of the wall. It was an open wound, and from it, the lullaby poured out, no longer faint and ethereal, but loud, clear, and achingly present. It was as if she had finally allowed it to breathe after 50 years of suffocation. The music filled the small attic, its sad notes echoing off the damp rafters. It was so beautiful and so profoundly sorrowful that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She had done it. She had broken through. She had found the source. The question now was, what had she unleashed? The secret was no longer just a sound. It was a physical presence waiting for her in the dark. A new smell, distinct from the attic's general stench of mold, wafted from the opening. It was the scent of a sealed space, of air that had not moved in decades. It smelled of dry ancient wood, the faint acidic sweetness of old paper, and a strange, cold, metallic tang, like rusted iron or blood. The smell was dense with history, with secrets left to fester. It was the smell of a time capsule. Ilara's hand trembled so much she could barely hold the lighter steady. She leaned forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and pushed the lighter's tiny, flickering flame into the opening. The darkness inside the wall seemed to drink the light, but she could make out the outlines of a small, man-made cavity. It was an alcove, not more than 1 meter deep and 1 meter high, a deliberate chamber hidden between the walls. And inside, sitting on a crude wooden shelf, was a small, dark object. As her eyes adjusted to the flickering light, she saw it clearly. It was an antique music box, its wood dark and rich, possibly mahogany or walnut. It was intricately carved with delicate patterns of flowering vines and sleeping birds, a work of forgotten craftsmanship. A thick, uniform layer of dust coated it like a grey velvet shroud, softening its sharp edges and hiding the true beauty of the woodwork. The clear, bell-like notes of the lullaby emanated directly from this object. A small brass key protruded from its side, and she could see the tiny, geared cylinder slowly revolving through a glass panel on its top. It had been playing, uninterrupted for years, for decades, its spring mechanism slowly, painstakingly winding down in the absolute, silent darkness of its plaster tomb. The thought was staggering. This tiny, beautiful machine had been singing its sad song to an audience of spiders and dust for half a century. With a sense of reverence that bordered on fear, Ilara reached into the cold, dark alcove. Her fingers brushed against the music box, and a cloud of dust bloomed silently into the air. The wood beneath was cool and impossibly smooth. It felt like satin. Her hands, chapped and raw from the cold and the work, felt clumsy and unworthy as she wrapped them around the small new heavy object. She lifted it carefully from its shelf. The moment she did, the mechanism shifted. There was a soft click, and the music stopped. The sudden, absolute silence that fell over the attic was 1,000 times more shocking and terrifying than the ghostly melody had been. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with expectation. The world seemed to hold its breath. Leo, who had been silent in his cocoon of coats, let out a small whimper. as if the absence of the sound had woken him from a trance. Ilara clutched the music box to her chest, its cold wood a strange comfort. Now that the music box was gone, her lighter flame could penetrate deeper into the alcove. The shelf it had been sitting on was just a rough plank of wood, but it wasn't empty. Something else sat on the floor of the cavity, something larger and darker, something that seemed to absorb the light. It was a chest. It wasn't a grand treasure chest from a pirate story, but something more squat, more utilitarian. It was dark, almost black, and bound with thick straps of a dull grey metal that she guessed was lead. It looked heavy, dense and ancient. A thick layer of dust coated it, but there was no lock to be seen, only a simple, heavy iron hasp holding the lid down. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind, starved and exhausted, leaped to the most fantastic conclusions. Money, jewelry, gold, a hidden family fortune, a way out, a future. This had to be it. This was the reason for the secret wall. For the 50 years of silence, this was their salvation. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely function. She placed the silent music box gently on the floor beside her and reached back into the cold, dark void. Her fingers closed around the iron hasp. It was freezing cold, the metal biting into her skin. It was stiff, but not locked. With a grunt of effort, she lifted it. It moved with a grating screech of rust on rust. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. This was the moment, the answer to everything. She hooked her fingers under the edge of the heavy lid and pulled. It was heavier than she expected. For a moment, it wouldn't budge, sealed shut by time and humidity. She repositioned her grip and pulled again, leveraging her weight against it. With a low, protracted groan of protesting hinges, the lid began to lift, releasing another puff of ancient, stagnant air that smelled of paper and secrets. The lighter flame flickered, casting dancing shadows inside the chest. For a split second, Ilara felt a crushing wave of disappointment. There was no glittering gold, no sparkling diamonds, no neat stacks of money. The chest was not filled with treasure, it was filled with paper. The disappointment vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a deep, humming curiosity that resonated in her bones. This was something else. This was not a treasure of wealth, but a treasure of knowledge. On the very top, resting on a stack of larger books, was a small bundle of letters. They were tied together with a silk ribbon that must have once been a vibrant color, but had now faded to a pale, ghostly shade of gray. The paper was yellowed to the color of old parchment, and the edges were brittle and flaking. The handwriting on the top envelope, written in a delicate, looping cursive, was faded but still legible. It was a confession. With trembling fingers, she lifted the bundle of letters out. They were light as a breath. Beneath them, filling the rest of the heavy, lead-lined chest, were several books. They were not printed books, but ledgers. 3 of them, each one thick and bound in dark, cracked leather. They were heavy, solid things, filled with the dense weight of recorded history. She lifted one out. The leather was cold and stiff, and the pages within were filled with neat, spidery columns of names, dates, and numbers. The ink was faded from black to a rusty brown, the air filled with the rich, musty perfume of old leather and aging rag paper, a scent that spoke of serious, secret business. She ran a finger over a page, feeling the slight indentation of the pen nib from so long ago. She had not found gold, but she knew, with a certainty that sent a chill through her entire body, that she had found something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. She had unearthed a story that was never meant to be told. The flickering flame of the lighter cast a dancing, golden glow upon the brittle, yellowed paper. Ilara sat on the freezing attic floor, the heavy, lead-lined chest open before her like a wound. The profound silence, a vacuum left by the music box's sudden stillness, pressed in on her ears. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the faded silk ribbon binding the small bundle of letters. The fabric felt impossibly fragile, like dried petals. Untying the knot felt like a desecration, a violation of a long-held pact. As the ribbon came loose, it crumbled into a fine, grey dust in her lap, a final sigh of its former life. She carefully unfolded the top letter, the paper crackling a dry, skeletal protest. The handwriting was an elegant, feminine cursive, but the frantic, slanted strokes spoke of a desperate urgency. A sick feeling of dread and reverence washed over her. This was not just an old letter, it was a message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean of time. Her eyes scanned the opening lines, written in a faded brown ink that looked like dried blood. To whoever finds this record, I pray you have a kinder heart than my husband. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The words leaped from the page, alive with a 50-year-old terror. Her great-grandmother's elegant script began to weave a story of horror within the very walls that now imprisoned Ilara and her son. She wrote of a man she no longer recognized, her husband, the family patriarch, a man consumed by a dark pact with the country's new military dictatorship. He had seen their rise not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. A cold knot of dread formed in Ilara's stomach. The words on the page were not just ink, they were ice, seeping into her, freezing her from the inside out. The musty smell of the paper seemed to intensify, filling her lungs with the scent of buried fear and complicity. The letter laid the truth bare, a truth more monstrous than the house's physical decay. This ancestral home had been more than a home. It had been a station in a pipeline of human misery. The basement, now surely flooded and collapsed, and the remote, crumbling outbuildings were used as unofficial holding pens for people the regime wanted to disappear. Political dissidents, outspoken artists, union organizers, journalists. They arrived in the dead of night in unmarked trucks, their faces hooded, their fates sealed. Ilara felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to close her eyes. The very dust she was sitting in felt contaminated, composed of the residue of unimaginable suffering. The rot of the house was no longer just neglect. It was a physical manifestation of a moral cancer that had taken root here long ago. She felt like an archaeologist who had not unearthed a treasure, but a mass grave. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was saturated with pain. Her great-grandmother's confession was one of a terrified bystander, a prisoner in her own home. She wrote of being forced into silent complicity, her days spent in feigned ignorance, while her nights were filled with the phantom sounds of muffled cries, the low rumble of engines, and the chilling finality of doors slamming shut. She described the hollow-eyed fear in the faces she was not supposed to see, the whispers that were quickly silenced. The chest and the meticulous records within it had been her only act of rebellion, a desperate, secret penance. It was her prayer that one day these documents would serve as a witness when she could not. A strange, heartbreaking empathy bloomed in Ilara's chest. She saw a reflection of her own powerlessness in this long-dead woman, another mother trapped in a house of horrors, fighting to keep a small flame of humanity alive in an overwhelming darkness. The 50 years separating them collapsed into a single, shared moment of female dread. With hands that shook uncontrollably, Ilara set aside the letters and reached for one of the heavy, leather-bound ledgers. The cracked leather was cold and stiff, like the skin of a cadaver. This was not a diary of feelings, it was a book of accounts, and the coldness of it was a new kind of horror. She opened it, the thick rag paper making a soft tearing sound as it unstuck from its neighbor. The first page was titled, in brutally neat script, Services Rendered. Ilara's blood ran cold. She forced herself to read on, her lighter's flame trembling, casting a hellish glow on the spidery columns that filled the page. Each entry was a chillingly banal record of evil. A date, followed by a name or, more often, a dehumanizing description. The professor, the student agitator, the journalist. It was a catalogue of stolen lives, reduced to a bookkeeper's neat lines. Beside each name was a number, a payment figure that made Ilara's stomach churn. And next to each payment, a signature of receipt, the looping, confident autograph of her own great-grandfather. This was the source of the family's supposed wealth, the foundation upon which their name had been built. It was a foundation of blood and bone. And then she saw the other name, the source of the payments, written over and over again with cold authority. Cole, Valerius. The name was a hammer blow, alien, and yet instantly significant. These weren't just records of imprisonment, they were invoices for suffering and death, a transactional account of complicity. The sheer, cold-blooded capitalism of the atrocity was more sickening than any tale of passionate cruelty. This was evil as paperwork, atrocity as a line item on a balance sheet, The lead-lined chest was designed not just to hide the documents, but to contain the sheer psychic weight of the evil they described. Her eyes fell back to the bundle of letters, and she snatched one that had separated from the rest. It described a specific captive, a young female journalist who had been writing articles critical of the regime. Her great-grandmother wrote of seeing the woman through a crack in a door, holding her small daughter. She wrote of hearing the journalist humming a simple, sad lullaby to the child each night, a sound of love in a loveless place. The letter described the melody, a tune of just a few notes that repeated like a prayer. It was the lullaby from the music box. One night, the letter recounted, the journalist and her daughter were taken away, and the lullaby was silenced. Ilara stared at the music box, now just a silent wooden object on the filthy floor. It wasn't a ghost. It was an echo, a memorial, a tiny mechanical tombstone planted by her great-grandmother, a final, desperate act to ensure that the child's song would not be completely erased. A raw, guttural sob tore from Ilara's throat. Suddenly, a sound from the modern world ripped through the attic's ancient silence, so alien it felt like a physical blow. It was the deep, throaty rumble of a powerful car engine, a sound of wealth and authority, growling as it navigated the rutted path to the house. The engine cut out, and the abrupt silence that followed was 1,000 times more menacing than the sound itself. Ilara froze, every muscle locking. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through her, cold and sharp. Her mind screamed, nobody came here. This place was forgotten, left to die. Her heart began to beat a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer just a victim of poverty. She was now the guardian of a secret that somebody had killed to protect. The sound from outside was not a visitor. It was a hunter drawn by the disturbance, by the scent of a freshly opened tomb. She heard the distinct, heavy slam of a car door, the sound sharp and definitive in the still night air. Then came the crunch of footsteps on the gravel and weeds. They were heavy, measured, confident steps. The steps of a man who was not afraid of the dark, of a man who believed the ground he walked on belonged to him. The steps crossed the yard, unhesitating, and came directly to the front of the house. Panic, white-hot and blinding, seized Ilara. She scrambled backward, shoving the ledgers and letters frantically back into the chest, her fingers clumsy with terror. The lid wouldn't close properly. She heard Leo stir, making a soft whimpering sound in his sleep, and a primal fear for her child eclipsed everything else. She had to hide the proof. She had to hide her son. But there was nowhere to go. The footsteps were on the porch now, followed by the agonizing groan of the front door being forced open. The footsteps echoed on the bare floorboards below, a slow, deliberate climbing of the ruined main staircase. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of fate ascending. Ilara pressed herself into the corner, behind the useless wooden chair, her hand clamped over her own mouth to stifle the sound of her frantic, ragged breathing. She pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear into the shadows and the dust. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the attic opening. A dark, imposing silhouette blotted out the faint gloom from the hallway. A man, tall and straight-backed despite his apparent age, hoisted himself into the attic with a startling viper-like agility. He was dressed in an immaculately tailored dark wool suit, an obscene statement of wealth and power in this derelict space. His shoes, polished to a perfect black gleam, seemed to mock the filth and decay on which they stood. The man stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping the scene with an unnerving stillness. He took in the desolation, the heaps of debris, the gaping hole in the wall, and finally, his eyes landed on Ilara. They were the coldest eyes she had ever seen, the pale, flat grey of a winter sky, holding an ancient, predatory intelligence. He gave a thin, humourless smile that did not reach them. "You must be Ilara," he said. His voice was a smooth, cultured baritone, the voice of education and authority, but it was layered with an unmistakable undertone of gravelly menace. "My name is Valerius. I own almost everything you see from this sad little hill, and I must confess, I have been waiting for someone to open this attic for a very, very long time." The name, spoken aloud, hit her with the force of a physical blow. Valerius, the colonel's son, the heir to the blood money. The monster was real. He gestured dismissively at the ruin around them, a flick of his wrist that consigned a century of history to trash. "This place is a blight," he stated, his voice flat. "An eyesore. Frankly, it is a danger to the community and a stain on my view." His cold eyes flickered for a half-second to the open chest, a barely perceptible acknowledgement, before locking back onto her face. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a thick, crisp manila envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He tossed it onto the dusty floorboards, where it landed between them with a soft, heavy thud. $50,000, he said, the words precise and sharp. Cash, for this worthless pile of rotting timber. More money than a woman like you will see in 10 lifetimes. Enough to take your boy and start a new life, somewhere clean, somewhere safe. The offer hung in the air, a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. He took a slow step closer, invading her space. The cloying scent of his expensive cologne, a mix of cedar and spice, was a nauseating intrusion on the attic's atmosphere of honest decay. His voice dropped to a low conspiratorial whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. "Some stories are better left untold. The past is a very messy business. A wise woman." He paused, his eyes flicking to the sleeping form of Leo, knows when to let it lie. His meaning was unmistakable. "This is a very old, very unstable house," he continued, his voice now silk over steel. "Terribly isolated. Unfortunate accidents can happen out here. A sudden fire in the night, a floor that gives way. It would be a terrible, terrible tragedy for a single mother, all alone out here with her young son." The threat, exquisitely veiled and brutally clear, hung in the air between them, aimed directly at Leo. Mr. Valerius held her gaze for one more chilling second, his face a blank mask of power. Then, without waiting for a reply he knew he would get, he turned with the same precise, controlled movements. He descended from the attic as if stepping out of a limousine, his heavy footsteps retreating through the house, each one a nail in Ilara's coffin, the roar of his car starting up, followed by the sound of it driving away, left behind a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. Ilara was left alone in the freezing darkness, her body trembling uncontrollably. The thick envelope of cash lay in the dust like a coiled viper. The documents in the chest were no longer a historical record. They were a death warrant. The money wasn't a lifeboat. It was a bribe to let the dead stay buried. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money, guaranteeing a safe future for your child? Or would you risk everything you have for a justice 50 years overdue? For a long frozen moment after the car's engine faded, Ilara did not move. She was a statue carved from ice and terror, her breath a ghost in the frigid air. The silence Valerius left behind was not empty. It was a humming, predatory thing, thick with his threats and the phantom scent of his expensive cologne, a smell so out of place it was a violation. The thick envelope of cash lay on the dusty floor, a patch of starker clean manila in the universal grime. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a silent, screaming siren's call to oblivion. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, now felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had found a story of ghosts, and in doing so, had summoned a living monster. The walls of the attic, which had been a prison of poverty, now felt like the closing jaws of a trap. Every creak of the old house was his footsteps returning, every whisper of the wind his voice, promising accidents and tragedies. He wasn't guessing. He knew what was in the chest. He had been waiting. Ilara's gaze drifted from the terrifying envelope to the small, bundled shape of her son. Leo was still asleep, his face peaceful in the grime, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, trusting rhythm. The sight was a dagger to her heart. Valerius's words echoed in her mind, a venomous whisper aimed directly at that small, sleeping form, a single mother with her young son. The threat had been surgical, precise, and utterly barbaric. This was no longer a choice between justice for the dead and a future for the living. Valerius had made it clear there was no future for them here if she refused, and if she accepted. She would be accepting blood money, becoming a part of the conspiracy of silence. Her son raised on a foundation of complicity. He would hunt her anyway, she realized with a sickening certainty. A man who buries secrets that deep does not leave loose ends. The money wasn't a choice. It was a distraction, a brief delay before the inevitable. Her survival and Leo's now depended on those ledgers. A new kind of resolve, hard and sharp as broken glass, cut through the fog of her fear. Despair was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had to act. But where could she go? The village was Valerius's kingdom, the local authorities his puppets. The memory of the silhouetted figure in the doorway, watching her arrive, flashed in her mind. She was an outsider, marked and alone. Alone? No. A faint, desperate memory surfaced. The premise mentioned another outcast, a recluse, Silas, the old groundskeeper, the man who lived in a shack on the edge of the property, ostracized by the very townspeople who worked for Valerius. If the entire town was in the wolf's pocket, her only hope was the lone sheep the wolf had cast out. It was a terrifying gamble. He could be just another fearful servant, or worse, a spy. But it was the only gamble she had left. She crawled over to the chest, her movements now filled with a grim, urgent purpose, and began to pack her strange, terrible inheritance. She wrapped the 3 heavy ledgers and the bundle of letters in her husband's old worn sweater, the last thing she had of his that smelled remotely of him. The fabric felt like a pathetic shield against the evil contained in the pages. She stuffed the bundle into her battered suitcase, the books making it unnervingly heavy. She left the music box. Its song had served its purpose. Its silence was now a more fitting memorial. She then took the envelope of cash. It felt greasy, contaminated, but it was also a tool. She shoved it deep into her coat pocket. Finally, she moved to Leo. She knelt beside him, her heart aching. "Leo," she whispered, her voice a raw, trembling thing. "Sweetheart, wake up. We have to go for another walk." His eyes fluttered open, confused and bleary with sleep. Seeing the terror etched onto his mother's face, he didn't complain. He just nodded, his small face a mask of silent understanding that was far too old for his years. Stepping out of the house was like stepping out of a tomb and into a graveyard. The night air was bitingly cold, and the moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, leaving the world in an almost absolute darkness. The woods that bordered the property were a solid wall of black, a place of unseen things and unknown paths. Ilara held Leo's hand in a death grip, the heavy suitcase banging clumsily against her leg with every step. Every snap of a twig under her feet sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of leaves in the wind was the sound of Valerius's men closing in. The house loomed behind them, a skeletal silhouette against the slightly less black sky, its empty windows like the eyes of a skull watching them go. She could feel its foul history clinging to her, a shroud she was desperately trying to outrun. She had no idea where Silas's shack was, only a vague sense that it was deep in the woods, away from the others. The journey was a blind, stumbling nightmare. Thorns tore at her thin coat and legs, scratching her skin. A low-hanging branch caught her across the face, making her cry out in pain and fear. The ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of tangled roots and slick patches of mud. The weight of the suitcase was an anchor, pulling her back, threatening to drag her down with every step. Her muscles screamed in protest, fueled only by the frantic, pounding engine of adrenaline in her chest. Leo, brave and silent, stumbled beside her, his small legs struggling to keep up. He didn't cry, but she could hear his ragged, frightened breaths, and the sound was a constant torment. She felt like a refugee fleeing a war zone, which, she realized, was exactly what she was. She was fleeing a war that had supposedly ended half a century ago, but had never really stopped for the ghosts of this land. Her own fear was a tangible thing, a metallic taste in her mouth. After what felt like an eternity of panicked, blind stumbling, she saw it. A faint, flickering yellow light, low to the ground, a single firefly in the crushing darkness. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through her. It was a small cabin, barely more than a one-room shack, built from rough-hewn logs. A thin curl of smoke rose from a crooked stone chimney, carrying the comforting earthy smell of burning pine. Unlike the other houses in the village, which felt shuttered and dead, this small dwelling felt alive, a tiny, stubborn ember of life refusing to be extinguished. It was a bastion of defiance in the heart of Valerius's dark kingdom. As they drew closer, the sound of a softly played harmonica reached them, a simple, bluesy tune that was the polar opposite of the music box's ghostly sorrow. It was a song of loneliness, yes, but also of survival. She paused at the edge of the small, clear-felled patch of land, her heart hammering. This was it. She was about to put her life and Leo's arm into a stranger's hands. She gathered the last of her courage and knocked on the solid wood door. The harmonica music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was tense, filled with a cautious listening. She heard a scraping sound like a chair being pushed back, followed by slow, shuffling footsteps. A bolt, heavy and metallic, was drawn back with a loud clack. The door opened a few inches, held by a thick chain. A sliver of a face, deeply wrinkled and framed by a mass of untamed white hair, peered out. The eyes were what caught her. They were a startlingly pale blue, sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. They took in her torn coat, the scratches on her face, the terrified child clinging to her leg, and the heavy suitcase in her hand. This was Silas. His face was a roadmap of hardship, his skin weathered like old leather, but there was no fear in those eyes, only a deep, ingrained weariness and a flicker of sharp curiosity. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. I am Elara," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm from the old house, the attic. I opened the attic." She didn't need to say anything more. At the word attic, a flash of understanding, of something akin to dread, crossed his face. The pale blue eyes widened, almost imperceptibly. He looked past her, into the darkness of the woods from which she had emerged, as if expecting to see demons following her. He looked back at her face, at the raw terror etched there, and then down at the worn suitcase in her hand. He seemed to weigh a lifetime of choices in a single, silent moment. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 60 years, he closed the door just long enough to unlatch the chain. It swung open wide. "Get in," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Quickly, before the night sees you." He didn't offer comfort or welcome, only sanctuary, and for Elara, that was more than enough. The relief was so profound it made her knees buckle. The inside of the shack was a single room, cluttered but meticulously clean. It was warm, the heat from a small, pot-bellied stove pushing back the predatory cold of the night. It smelled of wood smoke, strong black coffee and old books. Every surface was covered in stacks of books, tools, and jars of preserved vegetables. It was the den of a man who had long since retreated from the world, creating his own small, self-sufficient universe. It was the safest place Elara had been in since her husband died. Silas gestured for Leo to sit on a low stool by the fire, and the boy, exhausted past the point of fear, stumbled toward the warmth. Silas moved to the window, peering cautiously through a tiny gap in the heavy burlap curtain. He stood there for a long time, watching the dark woods, his posture tense. "He paid you a visit, didn't he?" Silas asked, his back still to her. "So delirious. He always knows when the ghosts are disturbed." The question wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of grim, unavoidable fact. "Yes," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. "He offered me money. He threatened my son." Silas finally turned from the window, and the weariness in his eyes was now mingled with a familiar, ancient anger. That's his way. The carrot and the stick. Always the stick for those who don't take the carrot. He looked at the heavy suitcase she had placed on the floor. "You found them, then? Her records, the ledgers." Again, it was a statement, not a question. He knew. He had always known. The realization hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. This man wasn't just an outcast. He was a witness. He was the guardian of the story, the one person left who knew the truth of what had happened in that house. She knelt on the floor, her hands shaking as she unlatched the suitcase. The act of revealing the ledgers to him felt momentous, a transfer of a terrible burden. She pulled out the top ledger, its dark leather cover seeming to absorb the warm lamplight, and pushed it across the floor toward him. Silas did not reach for the book immediately. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Pain, guilt, and a deep, profound sorrow warred in his pale eyes. He finally reached out a gnarled, trembling hand and laid it on the leather cover. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand there, his eyes closed, as if feeling the echoes of the horrors contained within. "I was a boy," he said, his voice now soft, haunted. "Just a boy. I worked the grounds. I saw the trucks come in the night. I heard things. My boss, her husband, He told me to keep my eyes down and my mouth shut if I wanted to keep breathing, and I did. I was a coward. His confession, spoken into the warm, safe air of the cabin, was raw and painful. He wasn't telling her a story. He was bleeding out a wound that had been festering for 60 years. The guilt he carried was a physical presence in the small room. He finally opened his eyes, and they were glistening with unshed tears. I knew he was involved in something evil. We all did, but we never knew how deep it went. We never knew the scale of it. He finally looked at Ilara, his gaze direct and filled with a terrible sadness. His complicity bought him wealth, but it bought me a lifetime of ghosts. I see their faces every time I close my eyes. The student with the glasses, the man who always wore a scarf, the young woman who hummed that sad little song. He looked at Leo, now dozing by the fire, and a spasm of pain crossed his face. And her child. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound of a man trying to speak around a stone in his throat. I have lived with the shame of my silence for 60 years. I am an old man. I am ready to stop being a coward. The declaration, so simple and so profound, hung in the air, a promise of redemption. But you don't know the worst of it, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. You found the ledgers, the proof of who was taken. But that's not the part Valerius is most afraid of. It's not just that they were brought here. It's where they went. He leaned forward, his ancient eyes burning with a feverish intensity. Why do you think he has spent his entire life buying up all the surrounding land? Every parcel, every farm, every patch of worthless woods. It wasn't for profit, it was for containment. The word hung in the air, cold and terrifying. Ilara felt a new kind of dread, a dawning horror that was even greater than what she had already learned. The open loop of the mystery was about to be closed with a final, brutal peace. He was not just protecting his father's reputation, Silas rasped. He was hiding the bodies. The words hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A mass grave. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The isolation of the house, the fear in the town, Valerius's obsession with owning the land, his violent reaction to her opening the attic. It was all a massive, 60-year cover-up for a graveyard. In the woods, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Behind the house. Silas nodded slowly, his face a grim mask. A stretch of forest to the north. An old, forgotten part of the property where the soil is soft. He made sure no one ever went there. He spread stories about it being haunted, cursed ground. And it is just not by ghosts. The image flooded Ilara's mind, the bones of the disappeared, of the journalist and her child, lying tangled together in the cold, dark earth, their stories silenced by dirt and time. The sheer monstrous scale of the evil was incomprehensible. Suddenly, Silas's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new urgency. He gave you an ultimatum, didn't he? A time limit. Ilara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. 24 hours, she managed to choke out. He'll be back tonight. Silas swore, a low, vicious sound. He won't come himself, not for this. He'll send his dogs, men who do his dirty work for him. They won't be there to talk. They'll be there to take those books and to make sure you can never tell anyone what's in them. They will burn that house to the ground with you and the boy inside it. The blunt, brutal assessment left no room for doubt. The countdown had started. The fuse was lit. Her time was running out, measured not in hours, but in minutes. She looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the monstrous fate that was rushing toward them. A mother's fierce, protective rage surged through her, burning away the last vestiges of fear. She would not let that happen. We can't stay here, Ilara said, her voice hard and clear. He'll know I came to you. This will be the first place they look. Silas nodded grimly. You're right, but you can't run into the woods blind. They'll hunt you down. He moved quickly then, his old body shedding its weariness, replaced by the sharp efficiency of a man with a plan. He went to a loose floorboard in the corner of the room and pulled it up. From the dark space beneath, he retrieved an old, tarnished silver locket and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He pressed the locket into her hand. This was hers, he said softly. The journalist's. I found it in the mud after they took her away. I've kept it all these years. The small, cold piece of metal felt impossibly heavy in Ilara's palm. It was a tangible link to the victims, a relic of a stolen life. It transformed her mission from one of survival to one of sacred duty. She was no longer just saving herself. She was fighting for them. "This is the important part," Silas said, unfolding the yellowed paper. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed, of the attic and the roof. He pointed a trembling finger at a spot on the drawing. "There's a loose panel in the north-facing roof, hidden by the chimney stack. It was a repair I made myself as a boy, and I never secured it properly. Your great-grandmother knew about it. It was her emergency exit." He then traced a line from the roof down the side of the house. "A great ivy grows on that wall. It's as thick as a man's arm, strong as a rope. You can climb down it, but only if you know it's there. It's your only way out. They'll come in the front door. They'll be looking for you in the attic. They will never think to look up, at the roof." The desperate escape plan, born of a 60-year-old secret, was their only hope. It was a fragile, terrifying lifeline in a sea of certain death. They had to go back. It was a suicidal thought, but it was their only option. The escape route was in the attic. They had to return to the heart of the trap in order to spring it. The walk back through the woods was even more terrifying than the first. Every shadow was a waiting thug, every gust of wind the sound of their approach. Ilara's body was screaming with exhaustion, but her mind was unnaturally sharp. Hyper-focused on Silas's instructions, the weight of the ledgers in the suitcase was no longer a burden. It was her armor, her weapon. She clutched the journalist's locket in her pocket, its cold shape a constant, grounding reminder of what was at stake. When they reached the clearing, the house stood waiting, a silent, hulking beast. It looked even more menacing now, knowing the full extent of the evil it concealed. Entering the front door again felt like willingly walking into a monster's maw. They climbed the ruined staircase, the silence of the house thick and expectant. Back in the attic, the air was just as cold, the smell of decay just as strong, but everything was different. The hole in the wall was a gaping wound, the open chest a vessel of truth. The envelope of money still lay in the dust, a worthless, obscene prop in a much larger drama. Ilara tucked Leo into his cocoon of coats in the farthest, darkest corner, praying he would stay asleep. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear," she whispered, her words a desperate prayer. Then she and Silas waited. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Minutes stretched into millennia. The rhythmic dripping of water was the only sound, a maddening clock counting down their final moments. Ilara's entire being was a coiled spring of tension. Her senses strained to the breaking point, listening for the sound that would signal the end, and then it came. It wasn't the refined purr of Valerius's luxury car. It was the loud, rattling growl of an old pickup truck, its engine badly in need of a tune-up. It barreled down the dirt track and skidded to a stop in the yard, its headlights cutting briefly across the boarded-up attic window, casting a fleeting, ghostly pattern of slats across the far wall. The engine was cut, and the ensuing silence was broken by the slam of 2 truck doors and the sound of rough, low voices, thick with malevolent intent. A shiver of pure, primal terror shot down Ilara's spine. Silas's prediction was coming true. The dogs were here. She grabbed the handle of the heavy suitcase, her knuckles white. Silas moved silently toward the chimney stack, his hand gesturing for her to follow. The time for waiting was over. The time for running had begun. This was the moment, the pivot upon which her life and her son's would either shatter or be reforged. They heard the front door splinter, not with a creak, but with a loud, violent crack of wood giving way. It wasn't forced open, it was kicked in. Heavy, booted footsteps stomped into the house, clumsy and loud, the sounds of men who had no fear of being heard. "Upstairs," a gravelly voice barked from below. "He said the attic. Find the books. And them." The casual brutality of the order stole the air from Ilara's lungs. They weren't people to these men. They were an objective, an obstacle to be removed. The heavy footsteps began to pound on the main staircase, 2 sets of them. A relentless, thundering harbinger of death. Ilara's heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She scrambled to the corner where Leo was hidden, her movements frantic. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing in the cavernous space below. They were on the 2nd floor now. "Leo, wake up," she whispered, her voice ragged with panic. "Leo, now! We have to go now." She scooped him up in one arm. He was groggy and disoriented, his dead weight making her stagger. With her other hand, she gripped the handle of the suitcase containing the ledgers. The weight of it was immense, a combination of paper, guilt, and the future. The heavy footsteps stopped just outside the attic entrance. There was a moment of absolute, heart-stopping silence, and then the sound of the men hoisting themselves up into the attic began. Ilara didn't wait. She followed Silas, who was already at the wall by the chimney stack, his old hands prying at something she couldn't see. "Here," he hissed, his voice a tense whisper. A section of the roof, about 2 feet square, came loose with a soft groan of old wood. A blast of icy, rain-scented night air rushed into the attic, a shocking gust of freedom. The opening revealed not a black void, but a dizzying view of the ground 3 stories below, partially obscured by a thick, writhing mass of dark ivy. The heavy footsteps landed on the attic floor behind them. "Hey, over there!" a voice shouted. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, pinning them in its white glare. There was no more time for stealth. Silas, with a strength that belied his age, shoved the heavy suitcase through the opening. "Go!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. "Don't stop for anything! Go!" He was positioning himself between her and the approaching men, his frail body a pathetic, heroic shield. Ilara, dragging a terrified and now crying Leo, scrambled toward the opening. The flashlight beam danced wildly, blinding her. She could hear the men shouting, their heavy bodies crashing through the debris as they rushed toward them. She shoved Leo through the opening first, his small body tumbling onto the steep, shingled roof. He let out a cry of terror as he started to slide. "Grab the ivy!" Ilara screamed, her voice raw with panic. She threw herself out after him, the rough shingles scraping her hands and knees. The cold was a physical shock. For a terrifying second, she thought they were going to slide right off the edge of the roof to their deaths. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, scrabbled for a handhold, finding the thick, gnarled vine of the ancient ivy. It was as thick as a rope, its rough bark digging into her palms. She grabbed Leo's collar with one hand and a thick branch of ivy with the other, her muscles screaming from the strain. Behind them, in the attic, she heard a sickening thud and a cry of pain from Silas as the men reached him. The sound ripped through her, a mixture of guilt and terror. There was no time to think, only to act. Clinging to the ivy, she began her desperate descent. It was not a climb. It was a controlled fall, a frantic scramble down a vertical jungle. The leaves were slick with a fine mist, and the branches tore at her clothes and skin. Leo was sobbing, his small body dangling precariously as she half-carried, half-dragged him down. Above them, a man's angry, bearded face appeared in the opening. "They're on the wall!" he roared to his partner. Ilara didn't look back. She focused only on the next handhold, the next foothold. Her lungs burning, her arms feeling like they were being torn from their sockets. The ground seemed impossibly far away. The rough texture of the ivy was the only thing keeping them from plunging into the abyss. Each movement was a prayer, a gamble. The wind whipped around her, trying to tear her from her perch. She could hear them above, crashing around in the attic, their angry shouts echoing in the night. They were trying to find another way out, another way to get to them. The thought spurred her on, fueling her with a fresh wave of adrenaline. Her feet finally touched something solid. Not the ground, but a lower roof, a small overhang above the rotted porch. From there it was a shorter, but still dangerous, jump to the weed-choked yard below. She let go of the ivy, dropping the last 10 feet with Leo still clutched in her arms. They landed in a heap in the wet, thorny weeds, the impact knocking the wind out of her. Pain shot up her ankle, sharp and blinding, but she ignored it. She grabbed the suitcase Silas had thrown down, its weight a familiar, terrible burden. The lights in the house were now moving frantically from window to window as the men searched for them. They had seconds. Ilara pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her ankle. She pulled Leo up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "Run, Leo, run for the trees," she screamed, her voice hoarse. She pushed him ahead of her, and then, dragging the heavy suitcase, she limped frantically after him. They plunged into the absolute darkness of the forest's edge, just as a flashlight beam swept across the yard, where they had been moments before. The sounds of the men smashing a window on the ground floor reached them, followed by more shouting. They were coming out. The hunt was on. Ilara crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping her face, the suitcase catching on every root and vine. She could hear the men's voices behind them, getting closer. They were in a blind, desperate race for their lives. Two small, terrified figures fleeing into the endless night, carrying the weight of a nation's buried sins on their backs. They burst back into Silas's shack, the door slamming shut against the night and the hunters. Ilara collapsed onto the floor, her body a symphony of screaming muscles, a sharp, blinding pain shooting up from her ankle with every frantic beat of her heart. Leo was crying, a raw, terrified sound that tore at what was left of her composure. Silas, his face already swelling and purpling where one of the thugs had struck him, shoved a heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound a definitive act of defiance. He was breathing in ragged gasps, but his ancient eyes were alight with a fierce, almost joyful fire. He stumbled to the corner, ignoring his own pain, and retrieved the old, untraceable flip phone from its hiding place beneath the floorboard. The heavy suitcase sat between them on the floor, a dark, silent witness. The ledgers were safe. The proof was safe. The air was thick with the smell of pine smoke, sweat, and the electric tang of fear. Her hand went to her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, smooth shape of the journalist's locket. It was a promise. Silas flipped open the old phone, its small monochrome screen casting a pale, ghostly light on his determined face. His gnarled thumb, surprisingly nimble, punched in a number he clearly knew by heart, a sequence of digits held in memory for decades like a prayer. He held the phone to his ear, his body rigid with anticipation. Ilara held her breath, every fiber of her being focused on this single, desperate connection to the outside world, this fragile electronic thread. "It's me," Silas rasped when the call connected, his voice a low growl of urgency that cut through the static. He paused, listening. "Janasti, I'm not all right, but I have it. I have everything." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of 60 unspoken years. The proof, nephew. The ledgers from the old house, the whole damned story, and I have the woman who found them. She's here, and her boy. They tried to kill them tonight. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Ilara could almost hear the gears turning. A man in a distant city absorbing a truth that would shatter his world. "Stay there," the nephew's voice, tinny and distant, finally crackled. "Don't move. We're coming." The wait was a new form of torture, a slow-motion agony of suspense. As dawn approached, it painted the single dirty window of the shack in bruised shades of grey and purple, the light feeling timid and unwelcome. The night's frantic adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the throbbing, insistent pain in Ilara's ankle. She had torn a strip from her own coat to bind it tightly, a pathetic piece of first aid in a world that had fallen apart. Leo had finally cried himself to sleep, his small body curled on Silas's cot, his face still streaked with tears and dirt. Ilara watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, a sight that both broke her heart and gave her strength. She found a damp cloth and gently wiped the grime from Silas's face, her touch tender on his swollen cheek. He winced, but didn't pull away. A silent understanding passed between them, the bond of soldiers who had survived the same battle. Every snapping twig outside, every call of a morning bird sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. They were so exposed, an island of truth in an ocean of lies controlled by Valerius. It did not begin with the scream of local sirens, a sound that would have signaled only more danger. It began with the quiet, professional hum of approaching engines. Through the grimy window, Ilara saw not a police cruiser, but 3 unmarked black sedans moving with silent, unnerving efficiency up the hidden track to the shack. The vehicles stopped, and men in sober, dark suits emerged, their movements precise and coordinated. Federal police. Their presence was an overwhelming statement of power, an authority that completely bypassed the corrupt local ecosystem Valerius had cultivated. Leading them was a man in his late 40s with Silas's sharp, pale blue eyes, but his face was unburdened by decades of guilt. He moved with a grim, relentless determination. This was the nephew, the investigator. He approached the shack alone, his gaze locking onto Ilara's through the window, his expression a mixture of profound seriousness and a deep, weary respect. The cavalry had arrived, not on white horses, but in government sedans. bringing with them the full, crushing weight of the law. The investigator entered the small shack, his presence filling the cramped space. The smell of the city, of clean wool and authority, clung to him. He looked from the battered face of his uncle to the terrified woman and her sleeping child, and finally to the heavy suitcase on the floor. "I am Investigator Ramos," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in their sea of chaos. "My uncle called me." Ilara felt the last of her strength give way, not to fear, but to an overwhelming wave of relief that made her knees weak. With hands that still trembled, she knelt and unlatched the suitcase. She pulled out the ledgers and the bundle of letters, laying them on the small, rough-hewn table. The air grew thick with reverence as Ramos, pulling on a pair of white gloves, carefully opened the top ledger. His breath hissed out. He traced the faded ink, the names, the numbers, the signatures. The sheer, banal evil of it was a palpable presence in the room. He looked at Ilara, his eyes shining. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered. The burden, finally, was no longer hers to carry alone. The convoy did not stop in the village. It swept past the shuttered homes and the fearful, curtain-twitching residents, a silent procession of judgment. It climbed the hill to the one place that had always been untouchable, Valerius's mansion. It was a monstrous structure of cold glass and steel, a modern fortress built to lord over the decaying town and its buried secrets. The raid was brutally swift. There was no negotiation, no warning. Federal agents swarmed the property from all sides. Ilara watched from the tinted window of one of the sedans, her heart pounding a triumphant rhythm. She saw him. They brought Valerius out the front door, not in his tailored suit, but in a silk dressing gown, his hair disheveled. The mask of untouchable power was gone, shattered completely. In its place was the face of a bewildered, terrified old man, his eyes wide with the shock of a king being dragged from his throne. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Ilara felt a 50-year-old chain break within her own soul. His empire of fear, built on bone and silence, had crumbled into dust in the morning light. Within hours, the patch of woods behind the old house was transformed. It was no longer a forgotten, cursed place, but a scene of immense and solemn activity. The entire area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and teams of forensic anthropologists in white hazmat suits moved with quiet, reverent purpose. The digging began. The story exploded across the national news, a dormant volcano of history erupting into the present. The discovery of the mass grave sent a shockwave of collective trauma and grief through the country. For decades, the families of the disappeared had lived in a torturous limbo. But now, the earth was finally giving up its dead. There was a name for their pain. The journalist's remains, and those of her daughter, were among the first to be identified. A small, tarnished silver locket found clutched in the child's skeletal hand, providing the final, heartbreaking confirmation. The sad, simple lullaby from the music box, her story now known, became a national anthem of remembrance, a song of justice for the silenced. Ilara was no longer a forgotten widow living in a dusty attic. She was a national hero. The media dubbed her the Weaver of Justice, the woman whose desperate search for shelter had unraveled a 60-year-old conspiracy. She stood in a formal government chamber, the glare of television cameras reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. She wasn't just awarded a medal, she was granted a substantial sum from the State Reparations Fund, a fund established to right the wrongs of the dictatorship. The number was staggering, an amount of money that her mind could barely comprehend. It was a fortune born not of blood, but of atonement. They handed her a crisp, official document. It was the deed. The old house, and all the surrounding land that Valerius had hoarded to hide his crimes, was now hers. Its dark history had been exorcised by the truth. She was no longer a trespasser on a plot of shame, but the sovereign owner of a piece of reclaimed history, a symbol of a nation's painful, cathartic healing. Her life, once worth $87, was now priceless. 6 months later, the house stood straight and proud against a bright blue sky, every trace of its decay erased. The new paint was the color of a robin's egg, the windows were wide and sparkling, and the porch no longer sagged in defeat. Inside, the air, once thick with the stench of mold and death, now smelled of lemon polish, fresh laundry, and the comforting aroma of baking bread. In the sun-drenched room where she had once huddled in the dark, a brand-new top-of-the-line sewing machine gleamed. Ilara sat before it, her hands no longer stiff with cold and fear, but sure and nimble. She guided a bolt of brilliant yellow silk under the needle, the machine's happy, rhythmic hum a song of pure creation, a triumphant reply to the attic's ghostly lullaby. Leo ran into the room, his cheeks full and rosy, his laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. He held up a crayon drawing of their house, a smiling sun shining down on it. Ilara felt a wave of joy so pure, so profound, it stole her breath away. She was home. The long, polished oak table was laden with food, a roasted chicken, steaming bowls of vegetables, a basket of warm bread. This was the same space where Ilara had once counted her last few coins, her stomach aching with an emptiness that was more than just hunger. Now that emptiness was filled with a profound and lasting peace. Silas sat at the head of the table, his face relaxed, the ghosts finally gone from his pale blue eyes. He was a beloved grandfather to Leo, who chattered happily about his day at school, a future of limitless possibility stretching before him. Ilara watched them, her heart so full of love and gratitude, it felt like it might burst from her chest. She had descended into the deepest darkness of her family's past and emerged into the light, carrying justice for the dead and a new life for the living. Her story is a testament to the fact that even when all hope seems lost, the courage of one person can rewrite history. If you believe in the power of truth and the unyielding strength of the human spirit, subscribe for more stories of impossible survival and ultimate redemption.